Throughout our nation's history, parents have always retained the God-given right to educate their children as they see fit. This duty and responsibility is given by God to parents to raise up and teach their children and to teach them in the ways of God. This is called a Christian education. It's a biblical worldview of this important area. Yet, for well over a generation, the creeping cancer, as I call it, within educational circles have sought to divide God, not just from government, but God from education, and ultimately dividing parents from their children, mostly effectuated through governmental policy where people are told that it's government's duty to educate children. Now, this scenario is now being played out in real life in the California General Assembly, where if it succeeds, the God-given right of parents to educate their children as they feel led of God is going to be severely attacked. And as we all know, so as goes California, so ultimately will go the entire nation. Now, to bring you and our listeners up to speed on a very critical happening in California and on an issue that really ought to be on every front page, but it's hardly mentioned, I have just officially welcomed you, Mike Smith, Stand in the Gap today.
Thank you, Sam.
So I'm glad that you're part. I just set up the program here for what's happening in California, and I want to talk a little bit more about homeschool legal defense in just a moment, Mike.
Okay.
But our listeners do not know of what's happening in California in the General Assembly. I want you to lay it out. What precisely is happening there that constitutes a veritable assault on parents and God-given rights for parents to educate their children? Something's happening there. We need to know about it. Tell our listeners what's happening in California General Assembly.
Well, Sam, thanks for having me. But first, before I get into that, I want to thank you publicly for your service to Americans, especially for those in Pennsylvania, especially homeschool families, because you were the champion, the only one we had in the Pennsylvania legislature for years. So on behalf of all of our families and all the homeschoolers in Pennsylvania, for once, publicly, I want to thank you. Thank you very much. So what's happening in California is there is the strong potential that we're going to have legislation filed, which would basically take a lot of freedom from homeschoolers. Currently, homeschoolers operate as private schools, and so they're under the private school law. They do file an affidavit each year, but there's very little regulation, and rightfully so. But what is being proposed is that essentially parents would have to submit to mandatory background checks, and if there was any problem in those checks, even if maybe a parent was convicted and they were innocent, then they wouldn't be able to homeschool. There's also the talk, believe it or not, but mandatory home visits, so that mandatory child abuse reporters would be able to get inside homes, homeschool families' homes, be able to look at the children, be able to examine their education, make sure that the family was offering a safe environment for the kids. And as a matter of fact, Sam, believe it or not, they're even talking about imposing the fire and health requirements on these, these private schools at home, where parents basically are not opening their home to anybody else, but they are teaching their own children. And then finally, they're talking about minimum teacher requirements, perhaps high school. I hope they wouldn't try anything above that, but high school, and some mandatory testing and curriculum review. I mean, all things are on the table.
Well, Mike, those are very scary things, frankly, for anybody who knows at all how these things can affect our freedom as parents.